In radical engagements here at Varn Blog, we do like to take listeners' suggestions pretty seriously. I have two listeners. One, a regular of the show, David E, who's I've been in exchange with and even argued with on air in certain places before for a long time, and also Ray Not W. I'm not going to give anyone's surname so that people who want to be corrected me on chastising Baudrillard for not seeing something that happened after his death. And that's fair enough. I actually realized that these essays were from the latest 2007. And actually, if one reads the introduction, which I admit I don't generally read, one sees that Baudrillard wrote them between 2004 and 2006 for the most part, or between 2003 and 2005, 2 years before his death. They were uncollected. I also, I'm going to read what Renat said to me because I think it's useful. Being a fan for many years on another profile and just wanted to give you a heads up on your recent Baudrillard video that I watched today, you might have to change some things on your presentation and discourse for your discourse to be tight. Also, because you could get flexed on pretty hard, despite being a good fella. I'm not gonna remove where I'm wrong. I don't think I haven't been flexed on, but I think it is important that we're honest about what we're saying. I did not think you noticed this, but the Agony of Power's collection of speeches written and given in 2005, before he died in 2007. It was published in 2010, introduced by the editor on page 7. People see unpublished text written in 2005, 2 years before the author's death. There are also dates on the first two speeches or the end of the page, which are April and October of 2005. This is important to point out because you spent a good chunk of the agony of your video on Baudrillard and the Agony of Power for things that he was not alive for, namely Great Recession. My retort to that, though, is business cycles had already shown to still be existent in 2001. There was a recession in 2001, right before 9/11, and the dot-com bubble had burst. This is not figured into his theorizing. But that's still an error on my part. I shouldn't claim that him missing the Great Recession is the kind of mistake that is totally invalidating from 2005 point of view. But I will say that to say that there was nothing to indicate that we weren't in the throes of a business cycle in 2005 is to ignore immediate economic history, at least in the United States, prior. This is the key moments in your video for this are 15 minutes and 20 seconds in, and then after 22 minutes and 30 seconds. This also ties to the paradoxes about him from 2010 and beyond apropos of social media. The narrative running through the video diminishes the valid points that continue to express, especially at the end. If you want to edit and redo the video, which I'm not going to do, I'm just going to do this response video here. I'd recommend starting at the beginning of the From Domination to Hegemony essay, which we're going to do. I'm going to honor this request. Rather than page 35, because there are vital details that will help you and your audience. Of the most importance is the cybernetic dynamic of hegemony. I skipped this because I don't think Baudrillard actually has a good definition of what cybernetics has historically meant, and actually takes a more limited view, just like Paul Virillo did, from a similar time period in the late 90s. But I'm going to start with that because I think it will clarify some things and maybe clarify where I disagree with him more clearly. Of the most importance are the dynamics of hegemony, like the elaboration from the domination of networks, although with the cybernetic control through them. Think of the cybernetic brain, the hegemon versus the coin, the piece of paper, the blip on the screen, along with their users. It is about the disembodied and personal forms of governments found through the cybernetic command. Yeah, this is interesting, but I think not a real understanding of everything that cybernetics was about. This might clear up some of the confusion expressed by starting in after 6 minutes and 40 seconds about Baudrillard and this new hegemonic configuration, which is no longer the hegemony of capital. Because it's not about capital functioning just fine, it's about what governs it and how. But cybernetics doesn't govern capitalism, and to assert that it does is still factually wrong from our current standpoint, even if Baudrillard couldn't have known that. Renat, I'm going to tell you where I disagree with you. The configuration of capital domination has been supplanted by the configuration of cybernetics information hegemony. Integral exchange goes beyond capital since information that expands exchange where capital becomes just another piece of information. This is actually very similar to something Mackenzie Work argued, and I thought it was wrong then too. I have more food for thought. I've broken that food for thought, by the way. But I want to first and foremost let you know the above concerns Situate do good work, and I think it's fair to criticize me for missing that. I still stand by what I said to some degree, but I think it's totally fair to say you can't judge Baudrillard for not seeing what had not happened after his death. So let's start with where he tells us to start. Thank you, Renat. From domination to hegemony. In order to grasp how globalization and global antagonism works, we should distinguish carefully between domination and hegemony. One could say that hegemony is the ultimate stage of domination in its terminal phase. Domination is characterized by the master-slave relation, which is still the dual relation with potential alienation, a relationship of force and conflict. It has a violent history of oppression and liberation, and there is the dominators and the dominated. It remains a symbolic relationship. As a side note, while that is true of the Hegelian thing, we say it remains a symbolic relationship. It is a symbolic relationship and a non-symbolic relationship, a material relationship and a symbolic relationship at once. I'm not sure even Baudrillard would disagree with that. I just think it's important to point that out. Everything changes with the emancipation of the slave and the internalization of the master by the emancipated slave. That's Nietzsche. Just want to point out where Nietzsche's coming in here. And before you correct my pronunciation, I realize that you pronounce it Nietzsche. I'm just not thinking in German at the moment. Hegemony begins here in the disappearance of the dual personal antagonistic domination for the sake of the integral reality. The reality of networks, of the virtual and the total exchange, where there are no longer dominators, are the dominated. So this is like the dark side of the cybernetic vision. Indeed, it could be said that hegemony brings the domination to no end. We, the emancipated workers, internalize a global order and its operational setup, which we are hostages for more than slaves. Consensus, be it voluntary or involuntary, replaces traditional servitude, which still belongs to the symbolic register of domination. Thus, the hegemon means one who commands, orders, and governs, and not one who dominates and exploits. This brings us back to the literal meaning of the word cybernetic. Cyberneti, the art of governing. Contrary to domination. As a side note, I literally just read a whole article about how cybernetics use of those terms is actually separate from the classical Greek use of those terms, and that Norbert Weiner didn't even know about the Platonic use of the term. That he thought he was coining a word that actually had prior existence. I am going to do a whole video on the origins of cybernetics and why this misunderstanding, this kind of like pseudo etymology reading, is kind of a problem. The humane use of human beings, for example, is not about just controlling human beings. It's about allowing them to govern themselves, which is kind of fundamentally different from what cybernetics labor means, and definitely different from this reduction to its Greek definition as it's used in Plato. So I still don't agree with Baudrillard. Sorry, guys. Contrary to the domination, a hegemony of world power is no longer a dual, personal, or even real form of domination, but a domination of not works of calculation of integral exchange. Domination can be overthrown from the outset. Hegemony can only be inverted or reversed from the inside. Two different, almost contrary paradigms: the paradigm of revolution, transgression, subversion, domination, and the paradigms of inversion, reversion, and auto-liquidation, hegemony. They are almost exclusive of each other because the mechanism of revolution, anti-domination, a history demonstrated, can become an impetus for a vector for hegemony. We can compare hegemony to the brain, which is its biological equivalent. AKA like Bordiga's The Party as a Brain of Society or something. That's an interesting relevant. And I don't know if Baudrillard would have known that, although he was familiar with French communism. I don't know how much he was familiar with Italian left communism. Like the brain, which subordinates every other function, the central computer assumes a hegemonic hold of the global power and therefore can serve as an image of our present political situation I don't think that's true even in 2005. And while we can chastise him for old uses of social media, etc., I mean that somewhat misses the point. To extrapolate this in this way is to miss that production is still driving everything, even in this time period, and that seemingly moving away from that, particularly in the time period where social media was not profitable, but seemed to are just internet media and different as a means of control is interesting. I mean, it's interesting to think about that kind of perversion of the cybernetic impulse. But I also feel like this is not illustrating an actual profound knowledge of cybernetics at all. This is illustrating a kind of cursory knowledge that should not have been forgiven. And I have this problem with Baudrillard a lot, where there's a lot of profound insight, but then there's a lot of like facile stuff proposed as answers to a key question. Let's continue though. Let's actually skip over that and go back to the economic illusion parts, because this is where things get contentious. But let's reread this with the idea that I totally missed the date of the essay when I read it. In any event, the question of capital must be reconfigured. Does something like capital still exist? And if there is a crisis, what is the essence of this crisis? We must pass through the looking glass beyond the mirror of production. Does exploitation still exist? Can we still talk about alienation? Asterisks, yes and yes. Have we become hostages, not slaves, but hostages of the global market under the definitive sign of globalization? I'm not sure that's as meaningful as you're making out to be Baudrillard. Can we still talk of a market? And hasn't capital reached the point of destroying the conditions of its own existence? Maybe. That's a more interesting proposition, but it's not working off of the cybernetic principle that you seem to be thinking as Baudrillard of integral exchange. One of the problems with generalized exchange is that the market is both ideal and a strategic location. It may be a fatal destiny of capital to go to the limits of exchange, to total consumption of reality. Its historical and Marxist definition, capitalism presided over multiplication of exchanges in the name of value. The market obeys the law of value and equivalency. The limit here is the limits of classic capitalism, and the crises of capital can always be resolved by regulating value. I'm not actually sure that Marxists think the crisis of capitalism can be resolved by regulating value, but nonetheless, I see his point. This is no longer true for the financial flows and international speculation that far surpass the laws of the market. Can we still speak of capital? Yes. Do we keep the term and the concept, therefore acknowledge the existential strategy that pushes capital beyond its own limits in a whirlwind of exchanges where capital loses its very essence, which is the essence of the market, and self-destructs an unbridled circulation that brings down the concept of exchange to an end? No. Or do we consider that it is no longer capital at all, but something radically different, an exchange that is not only general but total, completely freed from value in markets, an exchange that, having lost its rational principle, the principle of value becomes integral just as reality, having lost its reality principle, becomes integral reality from which there is no salvation. There's a lot of conflations here, even with the corrections that we've added. All right. Now, I think there's a point being made here about the increasing abstractification of capital and value flows, and there's way in which fiat currency and stuff like that does change the fundamental nature of capital, and in ways that we can argue about. But to say that these fundamental undergirdings are somehow undone by cybernetic controls and cycles of exchange and integral exchange and the information is to miss that all this has been an abstractification in the first place. And none of the abstractifications transcend the prior laws any more than having digitation transcends the fact that you still need fucking energy for it to all work. I think this is an interesting provocation, but it ultimately doesn't hold. All right. it's rooted in a lot of things, but I think a lot of people, frankly, are attached to mystifications of language from Mr. Baudrillard. And there's a lot of real insights, but there's a lot of overclaims that are thinly fleshed out in any of the books. So yes, I'm still sticking by my critique of Baudrillard's idea that information has transcended capital and that we have gotten beyond the material production crises because A, we know from 2007 forward that's not true, even if he wasn't alive for it. But B, that had already begun to break down in 2000, between 1999 and 2001, with the bursting of the dot-com bubble and this inability of these rents to actually generate enough productive capital to be self-sustaining. Bracketing that out in a kind of notion of cybernetics as a form of abstracted control of the brain of society, which again is not a particularly fleshed out understanding of what historical cybernetics was. All right. And it's almost based off of a misunderstanding about etymology. I mean, there's literally no works of cybernetics cited in this work. Let me go look at the back. Maybe there is later. I mean, before I get caught up saying anything. No. However, there are some questions in the back that may help. So, in the roots of evil, there are some interesting things that come up in an interview. So let's read that part. This is in the end of the book, an interview called "The Roots of Evil," where he talks about information. And whatnot. So let's get into that. And I'm going to read this to you. So I think this might be both clarifying and maddening. And before people say that I'm not bracketing out the discussions, I'm going to talk about the discussion. But there is something new, powerful behind this new myth and the absolute misfortune that the confused with evil. Isn't this confusion between the two intentional? And I'm going to remind people who's asking the question. This is Chronic Art who's asking the question. Let me see if there's footnotes on this. This interview is from. Make sure I get all this right. This no. Does it say? Is it dated? It does not seem to be dated here. Let me see if it's dated in the beginning. Before people come at me, I don't want to make any more careless mistakes. Let me see if it says in the introduction real fast. When is the interview from? Anyway, this is for Boring Radio. Since I'm not editing this, I'm not going to go into that. But let's read this. I'm not going to start where I said that I started. Let's see here. This is Baudrillard speaking to the interviewer. We are supposed to be able to fight misfortune, and we are even to attempt to theorize it subjectively today. Rampant victimality at every level and recriminations. We are in misfortune. We acknowledge it and enact it. The exact same thing happens with misfortune as Western culture enacting its own degradation. The identity reflex is found in misfortune itself, which brings us back to hegemony. In the system of domination, when you are a slave or even a salaried worker, you are in any case on the losing side, but you exist as such and not as a victim. That is why you can go on strike or revolt. In a hegemonic regime, on the contrary, we are not slaves but hostages. Therefore, we are all victims, all misfortune. In Greek, the word hegemon signifies a person who governs, who leads. It is governance and therefore has the same meaning as cyber, which etymologically means the art of piloting or governing. Again, this etymological argument that misunderstands that Norbert Weiner didn't know this exactly when he was talking about the human use of human beings, and this came up with the word of cybernetics. But nonetheless, let's not let someone else's use of what is effectively a pseudo etymology get in the way of understanding them. The era of hegemony is the era of the cyber system. It governs, it regulates, but it does not dominate. There is no longer any exploited or dominated. I'm blinking because that's a hell of a claim. There is something else, something much harder to overtake by surprise. It is harder to critique as well because critical thought is devitalized in this case. It is absorbed like a victim condemned to expressing him or herself into the void, or emptying him or herself of all substance. There is an impression that history is no longer driven by development, but by an independent and uncontrollable growth. Okay. An invasion has taken place. It is like turbo. It is a turbo system drawn by the vacuum that it creates before it. Something really happened in the last 5 or 10 years between the commemoration of the Holocaust, September 11th occurred, and the start of the mutation, not only in terms of political or economic or strategic consequences, but there was a phase of inversion in the system. September 11th was a predestined event. Okay. It would not have happened had the same resonance if it was not concretized or symbolically materialized, something that had been real for a long time. That's the loss of value in self-devouring cannibalistic culture. No one realized that it could not have gone on infinitely, but then suddenly the image froze, and its disintegrating power, at least virtually threatened by itself, something was violently materialized before the eyes of the entire world. This is the very definition of an event. When it is a legible, long-running process, becomes legible at the very moment by force of an unprecedented act. I'm torn on this because there's some wild flights of poetry in here, and I say this as a poet. A lot of this is rhetoric. You may call it theoretical rigor, but it's the prestidigitation of words. However, I do think there is a way in which, 9/11 is overdetermined. And in that reading of this, which is a charitable reading, Baudrillard's point still kind of maintains that there were all sorts of signs that presaged it, and that it also was kind of a capstone and concretizing of stuff that was already changing, and like the a kind of crisis management of capital that I've talked about before. So I don't want to say that Baudrillard's just talking nonsense here, because he's not. But the flights of poetry encapsulate some pretty Montan Bailey statements that where one reading is reasonable and the other reading is ridiculous. You mentioned clones several times in Cool Memories 5. What does this figure represent in the Empire of Good as you describe it? Clones are the possibility of perpetuating the species artificially. The answer is whether or not we attach strong symbolic value to the human species as such. If so, then clones are deviant, perverted. They negate the symbolic dimension of the species that implies the difference of each individual to continue to evolve. But here, people are seeking immortality. They do not want to disappear. They want to make the disappearances disappear. What they do not see, however, is that desire for cloning is just another way of disappearing, and a shameful one. It is a technological disappearance into an artificial survival, corresponding to the elimination of the human as human, and this process of disappearance has already begun. Again, there's a Montan Bailey reading of this. Does this objective bother you morally? Ethically, I'm against it, but I'm against the ethical positions in general. But I say that I oppose it in symbolic terms. For you, clones, like integral reality, are an image of the absolute perfection that's presented as a desirable perfection, while they are only something else, like an acceptable name for the death of the species. If you attempt to bring an end to sexuality and death, what rules are you contravening? This is where we get to Baudrillard's point. They do not interest me, but symbolic rule? Laws do not, they do not interest me, but symbolic rules? What happens if you eliminate the truth of all singularities implied in our own disappearance? You appear, you disappear. You eliminate the disappearance, there is no more singularity. And that seems to be the only thing that can resist, that cannot be reduced to an integral, total, totalitarian hold of insurmountable reality. With clones, the singularity explodes. You can call it progress. It all depends on your point of view. Clones are just one example among others. I include orientation, computerization, and the digitation of the world in this project. Artificial intelligence as well. Yes, I recently was reading a praise of plants and vegetation that offered a surprising point of view. What distinguishes animals from plants is sexuality and death. Because plants are immortal in a certain way due to their method of reproduction by sense of parity. I'm probably mispronouncing that. In the advanced scientific technological culture, we are talking about the path of plants. We are becoming vegetal. Using technology, we are trying to neutralize sexuality, including by way of generalizing it, and neutralizing death. Thus, we're entering a system of totally unlimited metastasis of the plant. Networks, the internet, all these things are unlimited metastasis. They're not limited. They have material beings. They have energy productions. Those energy productions require material inputs. Those material inputs require the consumption of goods and require you to produce them. They do not just exist in the symbolic realm unless you are only dealing with them superficially, Baudrillard. Reading the text, I found it funny to see how we may be deteriorating, passing from animal to plant stage. And God knows where it will end. That's an interesting inversion of teleology that is not implied in any developmental biology, but whatever, Baudrillard. Don't let me interrupt your poetry. Why plants, after all? It could be very good, for better or worse. I admire trees. I'm not praising the plant stage, but there is an anthropological mutation, if not an ontological one. Where are the good and evil in this context? The question of good and evil is not asked here. This is a mutation, that much is clear. The right question is, therefore, how far will we go? Will we go back to the almost inorganic state of the protozoa? This can be found in Freud with the death drive. Is that what is involved here? Or is progressive momentum leading us to another form of disappearance? Because in any case, we will disappear. Because it is a kind of illumination and not symbolically. And then he gets to cybernetics. So let me get to that point. I just want you to illustrate why I'm frustrated with this book, because while you are correct that I misidentified when he gave these speeches. The one I read is in 2005. I think this interview is in 2005. I'm not 100% sure of that, because there are some that are specifically dated and some that are not. But the introduction says they're all from 2 years before his death. So I guess that would be 2005. And I guess we can also, think that maybe some of these speeches, even though they were given in 2005, and that's why they don't have to put and whatnot, to be fair to Baudrillard. I mean, these were given as talks. Maybe were composed off of ideas conceptualized in 2003, 2004. And yes, I mean, some of these are themes that he's been playing on since the 70s. And I'm not saying there's no insight here. There is, but I find this maddening because there's a movement, there's like a statement of things as if it's telling you more than it is. And there's a way of like moving all this to symbolic realm where you can kind of say, well, this doesn't mean what it literally means, but it's unclear actually whether it means what it literally means. And if it's literal, then it's false. Particularly from the perspective of now. We could say Baudrillard couldn't have known that. I think some of these claims were even hard to make then. Even bracketing out the recession in 2007. And maybe even forgiving that the dot-com bubble was a minor recession, so it didn't seem like that big a deal. Although you can't explain any of it if you think that all this is just symbolic exchange going on through hegemony, governed through cybernetic systems, which is just the art of setting up a brain of society of which you cannot resist, and of which and which the primary importance is transhistorical symbolic mediation. I think a lot of people who wanted me to go back and correct my thing on Baudrillard, I think that I would be more sympathetic to him. I'm actually less sympathetic to him now. And I had read this entire book before, but now going back and reading it closely, I'm madder. You say that artificial intelligence, both the death of intelligence and the death of consciousness. It might be the death of consciousness. I think calling it AI is actually a misnomer in the first place. Deep machine learning being called artificial intelligence was mostly branding. Is that we reject the machine, both in intelligence and consciousness? Artificial intelligence is the reign of hegemony. The brain has become the biological version of hegemony. Everything is subordinated to the brain in the image of order of the computer. Everything is governed, cybernized, brought back to the ordering power of the brain. Everything else, the body, is left aside, except the brain doesn't work without the body. Just like the internet doesn't work without power inputs. You can't have a society based off the brain. And I guess in some ways you are correct in saying that like things are subordinated to that, but how subordinated? And what's still driving them? The metabolic process that's in your stomach still keeps your brain alive. Your heart pumping still is required for the brain. Other cultures disdained the brain. For the Greeks, it did not even exist. It was useless viscera. So what? That has nothing, like, you're treating all biological epochs as if they're like unilaterally true. For us, the brain rules as a form of the digital, the binary intelligence. In the case that is not the same at all. I don't know that even in 2005 you can say that most people who studied consciousness thought it was a binary intelligence. In fact, we'd already been pushing back against that. As for consciousness, what place would it have in a digital universe? It is a form of intelligence, but it does not think, as Heidegger would say, it calculates. I think that's actually a fair point. It is a positive intelligence. It is the negative that is completely left out. There's no work of the negative here. You're going to have to define the negative better than that. In the cybernetic universe where everything is calculable, can't evil in the sense of disorder and chaos slip into and penetrate the integral reality of the network? Isn't that what hackers do, for example? Accidents are involved, certainly. Paul Virilio speaks of this much better than I can, but it is what I am saying of another order. It is unpredictable. It is power turning against itself. It is not necessarily the apocalypse, but it is a disaster in the sense of a form made irrepressible regardless of the will of the actors, and their negative actions are sabotage. Certainly, many things happen to the system, but is always objective or objectively negativity related to the technology itself, not a symbolic interruption. I'm afraid this game remains integral to integral reality. Perhaps there are some who can penetrate the cracks in this cybernetic universe? Question mark. I must say that I do not know the integral rules of the game for this world, and I do not have the means to play it. Then shut up about it. This is not a philosophical or moral disavowal or a prejudice on my part. That's not for you to say, buddy. It is just that I am situated somewhere and cannot do otherwise. From the outside, I can see that everything works and the machine allows everything to function and lets us allow the system to proceed normally or abnormally until it runs its course. Leaves us to the machine where it belongs to the machine without trying to humanize it or make it an anthropomorphic object. For me, I will always have an empty, perfectly non-functional, and therefore free space where I can express my thoughts. Once the machine has exhausted all of its functions, I slip into what is left without trying to judge or condemn it. Judgment is far into the radicality of thought. This thinking has nothing scientific, analytical, even critical about it, yet clearly. Yet those aspects are not all regulated by machines. And maybe a new space domains for thought is now opening. That's the end of the book. For people who wanted me to read Baudrillard, but reevaluate my stance on Baudrillard and his stance on hegemony, I think it is interesting what he's talking about with the abstractification of power. But he makes fundamental assertions that can only be taken either metaphorically, in which case they don't have that much power, they're analogous and weak, or as like ontological pronouncements of a shaman or something. But if you take them as literal predictions of fact, they're not true. And I'm sorry, there's not two ifs about that. You can be attached to your own particular thinkers, of which you've trained yourself to accept propositions by rereading them in ways in which they are unquestionable. This has become an academic habit. We here do not subscribe to that academic habit. We here do not subscribe to the petty terrorism of theorists who make you accept their categories in such a way that they are unarguable because their categories sneak in their arguments. No. This is not to say that Baudrillard is useless or should not be engaged with. I find much of this, not this particular book kind of pisses me off, but I find much of this actually insightful about the way we experience a lot of this, or the way that our intersection of this leads to certain ways of processing or understanding the order of the contemporary world, and the way it is symbolically mediated. But it does not actually deal with the larger questions of why things get this way. And in fact, its categories almost make it impossible to do so. I hate to be the dirty analytic here, but I do think Dan Dennett's deepities apply to a lot of these statements. They're Mont and Bailey's. they're hedged. So even the inside is overcut by the hedging. And you should think about this when you approach theorists. And maybe there's more context I'm missing, but I have gone through this book and I've also looked at other things. Should I make sure that I'm presenting this to you correctly? Because last time I was a little bit more sloppy when I approached this book. I'm not going to do that again. But we need to think about this. What is Baudrillard saying that is true, and what is Baudrillard saying that is false? There is an abstractification of both order and power, but it's based on a very real, very concrete material reality, which symbolic mediation is a second order, not a first order concern. Make of that what you will. Like and subscribe. And if you want to correct me or have me engage more, send me a thoughtful comment like our friend here, Renat, or David E, because David E was very frustrated with Baudrillard, but made sure that I also understood that I had misdated my statements, and thus was holding him accountable for something he couldn't have known. And that's a fair thing. So if you ever encounter me making those kind of errors, and people do, I'm not a Baudrillard specialist. I don't claim to be. I have read a lot. If you look, you can't see it, but there are at least 15, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 Baudrillard books back there. And I have read them. So, but I haven't read everything. And maybe there's pieces of context that I need if you can throw it my way. Or if you're a Baudrillard scholar and would like to reach out because you think I'm being unfair, or maybe you think I'm being fair but not complete or whatever, feel free to reach out. You're welcome to. Like and subscribe. We at Radical Engagements do like to engage with our audience as well. So if you contact me via Facebook, my Facebook take, I don't check it that often, I'll admit, particularly my public one, but I do check it. So one of these was a Facebook comment, so it took me a while to get to. All right, good night and good luck. Thank you for watching Radical Engagements. I will be linking the video that there are errors to in the show notes.